In 1925, a young man named Howard Deering Johnson took over a small patent medicine store in the Wollaston neighborhood of Quincy, Massachusetts, financing the purchase with borrowed money that public accounts generally place at around $2,000. The shop sold newspapers, cigars, and over-the-counter remedies, and it carried the modest soda fountain that was standard equipment in American drugstores of the period. Johnson had no formal training in food service, no college education, and no family fortune behind him. He had left school as a teenager to work in his father's cigar business, which had struggled after the First World War. What he noticed within months of opening his doors was that the soda fountain outsold nearly everything else in the store. Customers came for ice cream and stayed for little else. It was a small observation in a small shop on a commuter rail line south of Boston, but Johnson treated it as data rather than luck. He began to concentrate the business around the fountain, and in doing so, he set in motion one of the most consequential experiments in the history of American food retailing. The company that grew from that corner store would, within 4 decades, serve more meals each day than any commercial organization in the United States. Johnson's first genuine product decision concerned the ice cream itself. Dissatisfied with the commercial mix he had been buying, he sought a richer formula, and the result was an ice cream with roughly double the butterfat content of typical commercial products of the era, made with natural flavorings rather than the synthetic syrups common at the time. Popular accounts differ on the origin of the recipe. One frequently repeated version holds that Johnson purchased the formula from an elderly street vendor for a few $100s, though the story is difficult to verify and may be partly promotional folklore. What is well documented is the commercial outcome. Johnson expanded from 3 flavors to a rotating catalog of 28, a number that became one of the most durable slogans in American marketing. Flavors such as butter pecan, banana, burnt caramel, pistachio, and coconut gave the brand a sensory identity long before it had a national footprint. He opened seasonal ice cream stands along Wollaston Beach, where summer crowds produced revenue that reportedly astonished local observers. The lesson Johnson drew was that quality at scale, priced for ordinary families, could outperform novelty. Ice cream remained the emotional core of the company for the rest of its existence. In 1929, Johnson opened his first full-service restaurant in the Granite Trust Building in downtown Quincy, an establishment with table service, a broader menu, and higher ambitions than any beach stand. The timing appeared catastrophic, arriving only months before the stock market crash, but the restaurant benefited from an unusual piece of fortune. Boston's mayor had effectively blocked the local staging of Eugene O'Neill's play Strange Interlude, and the Theater Guild moved the production to a theater in Quincy, close to Johnson's new restaurant. The play ran roughly 5 hours with a dinner intermission, and audiences of well-connected Bostonians filed into Howard Johnson's night after night. The episode gave the restaurant visibility far beyond its neighborhood and a reputation among people who could afford to travel and dine during the Depression. Johnson survived the early 1930s while thousands of independent restaurants failed. The experience shaped his conviction that location and circumstance mattered as much as cooking, a principle that would later govern the company's entire real estate strategy along American highways. The innovation that historians most consistently credit to Johnson arrived in 1935, when he lacked the capital to expand but possessed a brand that customers trusted. He persuaded an acquaintance, Reginald Sprague, to open a restaurant in Orleans on Cape Cod under the Howard Johnson's name, with Sprague putting up the investment and agreeing to buy food and supplies from Johnson while conforming to his operating standards. The arrangement is widely regarded as one of the first true restaurant franchise agreements in the United States, predating the franchising booms of the post-war era by 2 decades. The model solved a structural problem of the Depression economy: expansion without access to credit. Local businessmen supplied capital and community standing. Johnson supplied the name, the products, and the system. Within a year, dozens of additional franchised restaurants had opened across New England. By the end of 1939, the chain counted just over 100 restaurants stretching down the eastern seaboard as far as Florida. The franchise concept that Johnson refined would later be adopted, in various forms, by nearly every major American food and lodging brand of the 20th century. Johnson's second structural insight concerned geography. While most restaurateurs of the 1930s competed for downtown storefronts, Johnson placed his buildings on the roads between cities, betting on the automobile as the defining instrument of American life. His restaurants appeared at highway junctions, on the approaches to beach towns, and along the new parkways of the Northeast, positioned for families in motion rather than pedestrians. The company promoted itself as a host to travelers, and the promise was consistency. A family driving from Hartford to Portland could stop at any orange roof and receive the same fried clams, the same coffee, the same clean restrooms. That promise, ordinary as it sounds today, was close to revolutionary in an era when roadside food was a gamble of unmarked diners and variable hygiene. By 1941, the network had grown to roughly 170 restaurants, supported by more than 10,000 employees. Howard Johnson's had effectively invented the standardized roadside restaurant, and in doing so, it helped make long-distance automobile travel a normal middle-class activity. The company's visual identity was engineered with the same deliberation as its menu. The buildings adopted a colonial revival vocabulary, rendered in white clapboard and shutters, crowned by a roof of bright orange porcelain enameled tiles and a slender cupola topped with a weather vane. The orange was not decorative whimsy, it was chosen for visibility, a color that registered in a driver's peripheral vision at highway speed and held its brilliance in rain and dusk. Sea blue trim completed a palette that became one of the most recognized in American commerce. The company's emblem showed Simple Simon and the Pie Man, a nursery rhyme tableau of a boy, a baker, and a dog, rendered on signs, menus, and matchbooks. Architects and designers refined the formula over decades, and later modernist buildings by figures such as Rufus Nims carried the orange roof into sleeker forms. The result was a piece of applied psychology. Parents saw reassurance, children saw ice cream, and both could identify the building from a quarter-mile away. Few American brands before or since have fused architecture and marketing so completely. Johnson's most commercially astute maneuver may have been his pursuit of exclusive contracts on the new limited-access turnpikes. When the Pennsylvania Turnpike opened in 1940 as the country's first superhighway, Howard Johnson secured the restaurant concession, eventually operating the Service Plaza restaurants along the route under an exclusivity that persisted, by most accounts, until 1979. Similar contracts followed on the Ohio Turnpike, the New Jersey Turnpike, and other toll roads as the network spread after the war. The economics were unlike anything else in food service, a captive population of hungry travelers, no adjacent competition, and traffic volumes guaranteed by the road itself. These concessions gave the company a stable revenue base that cushioned it through downturns and financed expansion elsewhere. They also placed the brand at the physical center of the American driving experience for 2 generations. For millions of families, the Turnpike rest stop and the orange roof were a single memory, inseparable from the vacations and relocations that defined post-war mobility. The Second World War nearly destroyed the company that the Depression had made. Gasoline rationing emptied the highways, and food rationing constrained menus. A chain built entirely around automobile travel watched its customer base vanish by government order. The number of operating restaurants collapsed, and by several published accounts, only about a dozen locations remained open at the low point, though precise figures vary among sources. Johnson kept the enterprise alive by converting capacity to war-related food service, feeding workers at defense plants, and producing food for military and institutional clients. It was an unglamorous pivot, but it preserved the corporate organism, the commissary infrastructure, and the brand's legal and financial skeleton until peace returned. The episode demonstrated both the fragility of a single strategy business and the adaptability of its founder. When the war ended, Howard Johnson's was intact, solvent, and positioned in front of the greatest expansion of automobile travel in human history. The post-war years rewarded that position on a scale even Johnson could not have fully anticipated. Returning veterans bought cars, moved to suburbs, and produced the baby boom. And the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the interstate system that would rebuild the national map around the automobile. Howard Johnson's expanded aggressively along the new corridors, and the company's revenues grew into the hundreds of millions of dollars by the late 1950s. In 1954, the company opened its first motor lodge in Savannah, Georgia, extending the logic of the standardized restaurant to the standardized bed. The reasoning was symmetrical. A family that trusted the orange roof for dinner would trust it for the night. The lodging division grew alongside the restaurants, typically franchised, typically sited beside a company restaurant, so that the two businesses fed each other in a closed loop of travel demand. By the early 1960s, the combined enterprise was no longer a restaurant chain in any conventional sense. It was an infrastructure of American mobility, as much a part of the highway as the pavement itself.
The motor lodges multiplied through the 1960s and early 1970s until they numbered more than 500 across the country, most of them franchised to local operators under detailed brand standards. The lodges advertised air conditioning, television, swimming pools, and predictable cleanliness at a moment when independent motels varied wildly in quality. A lamplighter figure joined the company's iconography, signaling hospitality after dark, and the orange roofline carried over from the restaurants, so that a single glance from the road communicated both food and shelter. For traveling families of the 1960s, the formula removed anxiety from the unfamiliar. For business travelers, it standardized the expense account night. The lodging business also diversified the company's risk, since rooms produced revenue in seasons and hours when dining rooms sat idle. In retrospect, the motor lodge division proved to be the most durable component of the entire enterprise because it was the piece that survived under successive owners into the 21st century, long after the last fried clam was served under an orange roof.
Behind the dining room stood an industrial system that most customers never saw and that historians of the industry regard as genuinely pioneering. Howard Johnson's built central commissaries, including a principal facility in Brockton, Massachusetts, where soups, entrees, and signature items were prepared in volume, flash frozen, and distributed by truck to restaurants along the seaboard. Individual locations finished the dishes in standardized kitchens, which meant a location could deliver a consistent menu with semi-skilled labor rather than a full brigade of cooks. The system controlled portion size, ingredient cost, and quality simultaneously, and it anticipated by decades the supply chain logistics that fast food chains would later claim as their own inventions. Johnson was, by the accounts of employees and competitors alike, obsessive about enforcement, traveling between locations to inspect kitchens, taste ice cream, and audit cleanliness. The commissary model had a defect that would surface later. Food engineered for freezing and reheating could drift toward blandness in careless hands. But at its peak, the system was studied throughout the industry as the standard for large-scale consistency. In 1959, Howard Deering Johnson handed the presidency of the company to his son, Howard Brennan Johnson, who was then in his 20s, making him one of the youngest chief executives of any major American corporation. The founder remained as chairman and treasurer, watchful but gradually receding, until his death in 1972. The company went public in 1961, listing on the New York Stock Exchange, and the offering was received as the arrival of a blue-chip institution rather than a speculative restaurant stock. The younger Johnson was Yale-educated, financially sophisticated, and by most accounts, more comfortable with balance sheets than with kitchens. Under his leadership, the company grew steadily, diversified its concepts, and maintained margins that impressed Wall Street. Critics inside and outside the company would later argue that the son managed the enterprise for reported earnings while underinvesting in food quality and building maintenance, a judgment that hardens with hindsight. At the time, however, the numbers appeared to vindicate him, and the transition was celebrated as a model of orderly succession in a family enterprise. One of the more remarkable chapters in the company's food operations began in 1961 when it retained two French chefs of the first rank, Pierre Franey, formerly of the celebrated New York restaurant Le Pavillon, and a young Jacques Pepin. Pepin, by his own account, declined an offer to cook in the Kennedy White House in favor of the Howard Johnson's Commissary in Brockton, reasoning that he would learn more about America inside a mass-production kitchen than in a mansion. For roughly a decade, the two men worked on the company's base recipes, improving the clam chowder, the beef stew, the frankfurters, and the sauces, translating classical French technique into formulations that could survive flash freezing and distribution at industrial scale. The arrangement remains one of the strangest and most instructive alliances in American food history, hot cuisine placed in service of the turnpike traveler. Both chefs later described the period as formative, and food writers have credited the collaboration with raising the ceiling of what chain food could be. That two of the century's great cooks spent their prime years perfecting frozen entrees for a roadside chain says a great deal about what Howard Johnson's represented at its height. The menu itself became a catalog of American middle-class memory. The fried clam strips, cut from sea clams and breaded under the Tendersweet brand, were so closely identified with the company that competitors measured their own seafood against them. The Frankfurters, notched and grilled in butter and served in toasted split-top buns, were listed on menus as Frankforts, a New England spelling the company carried nationwide. The ice cream counter, with its 28 flavors, anchored the front of the house, and many locations operated separate ice cream shops with counter service. Chicken pot pie, baked macaroni and cheese, Welsh rarebit, and brown bread reflected the company's Yankee origins, while children's menus and booster seats signaled that families were the intended customer. None of it was ambitious cooking by restaurant standards, and the company never pretended otherwise. It was engineered comfort, priced for a salesman's expense account or a family of 5, and for 2 generations of Americans, the taste of a HoJo clam roll or a butter-grilled Frankfurt was inseparable from the experience of the road. The statistical peak arrived in the mid-1960s and held through the following decade. Published retrospectives note that in 1965, the company's sales exceeded those of McDonald's, Burger King, and Kentucky Fried Chicken combined, a comparison that later generations find difficult to believe. Industry accounts of the era described Howard Johnson's as the largest commercial feeder of Americans, second overall only to the United States Army. By the mid-1970s, the system counted roughly 1,000 restaurants and more than 500 motor lodges, spread across dozens of states, a mixture of company-owned and franchised operations. Annual revenues approached $750 million near the end of the decade. The orange roof appeared in postcards, television programs, and films as visual shorthand for the American roadside. Stanley Kubrick placed a Howard Johnson's lounge in the orbiting space station of 2001: A Space Odyssey, a small joke that assumed the brand would outlive the century. At that moment, the assumption seemed entirely reasonable. The company's history also intersects with the central moral conflict of its era, and the record deserves plain statement. Howard Johnson's was a Massachusetts company, but many of its southern locations, particularly franchised ones, observed segregation into the early 1960s. In Durham, North Carolina, the Howard Johnson's restaurant on Chapel Hill Boulevard became a principal target of the Freedom Highways campaign, organized by the Congress of Racial Equality in 1962, which sought to desegregate businesses serving interstate travelers. On August 12th of that year, following a rally of more than 500 people at a local church, demonstrators caravaned to the restaurant's parking lot, and protests continued Sunday after Sunday for the better part of a year. Students in northern cities picketed Howard Johnson's locations in sympathy. The Durham restaurant, along with most of the city's eating establishments, desegregated following mass demonstrations in 1963, ahead of the Civil Rights Act that made the question federal law. The episode illustrates how thoroughly the brand had become public infrastructure. When Americans fought over who could sit at the nation's table, some of that table stood under an orange roof. The decline, when it came, arrived from several directions at once. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 and 1974 emptied the highways for the second time in the company's history, and this time the customer had alternatives. Fast food chains, led by McDonald's, offered meals in minutes at prices below a HoJo check, while newer family restaurants offered fresher food in more contemporary rooms. Internal cost discipline, long a point of pride, began to read as deterioration. Critics and former executives described smaller portions, cheaper ingredients, aging dining rooms, and a menu frozen in an earlier decade. The company diversified into the Ground Round, launched in 1969, and the Red Coach Grill, but the new concept diluted attention rather than restoring momentum. The second energy crisis in 1979 struck the highway trade again. The deeper problem was structural. The interstate exits that Howard Johnson's had pioneered were now crowded with competitors that had studied its methods, improved on its speed, and undercut its prices. The advantages of the founder's system had been absorbed by the industry that grew up around it.
In 1979, Howard Brennan Johnson agreed to sell the company to Imperial Group, a British conglomerate with interests in tobacco, food, and brewing, for approximately $630 million, or $28 per share, in a transaction completed in 1980. The price bought just over 1,000 restaurants and more than 500 motor lodges. The sale ended 54 years of family control, and it began the least successful chapter in the company's history. Pre-tax earnings, reported at $34 million in 1979, fell by more than half the following year and never recovered under British ownership. Imperial's attempts to modernize menus and properties gained little traction against better capitalized competitors. In 1985, Imperial sold the Howard Johnson Company to Marriott Corporation for roughly $314 million, about half of what it had paid 6 years earlier. Marriott wanted the real estate and the Turnpike locations, not the brand. It kept the company-owned restaurants, converting many to its own concepts, and immediately sold the franchise system and the lodging business to Prime Motor Inns for $97 million. The empire had been disassembled into parts, and the parts were worth more to the buyers than the whole. What followed was a long, quiet subtraction that lasted almost 4 decades. The franchised restaurants, cut off from the commissary system and central support, closed one by one as leases expired and operators retired, their buildings surviving as Chinese restaurants, banks, and funeral homes, whose rooflines still betrayed their origin. The lodging brand passed through successive owners, from Prime Motor Inns to Blackstone-affiliated hospitality franchise systems, later Cendant, whose hotel businesses became Wyndham Worldwide. Along the way, in 2005, the hotel organization consolidated its rights to the Howard Johnson name. The restaurant count dwindled from hundreds to dozens to a handful. The location in Lake Placid, New York, closed in 2015, and the restaurant in Bangor, Maine, followed in 2016, after roughly 50 years of operation. That left a single orange roof in Lake George, New York, which operated amid publicized management troubles until it closed in the spring of 2022, without ceremony, ending 97 years of continuous Howard Johnson's food service in America. No national announcement marked the moment. The last restaurant of what had been the largest chain in the country simply did not reopen for the season.
What remains of Howard Johnson's today is a hotel brand and a body of method. Howard Johnson by Wyndham operates on the order of a few hundred economy hotels across several countries, according to the parent company's public materials, serving travelers who mostly have no memory of fried clams or 28 flavors. The more consequential legacy is invisible and everywhere. The franchise agreement Johnson pioneered in 1935 became the organizing structure of American food service, lodging, and much of retail. The commissary and flash freezing system prefigured the supply chains of every national chain that followed. The insight that a brand could sell predictability itself rather than any single product underlies the modern hospitality industry, and executives from Marriott to McDonald's operated in territory Howard Johnson's mapped first. The company's failure carries its own instruction. The systems that build an institution can calcify into the habits that end it, and no market position, however dominant, survives inattention to the customer of the next decade. The orange roofs are nearly all gone, repainted or demolished, but the America they helped organize, an America that eats, sleeps, and moves along its highways with confident expectations of what it will find, is still driving past where they stood.